Thank you all very much and welcome. My name's Steve Drummond. I'm the education editor at National Public Radio in Washington, where I've been for about 24 years. And one of the big questions in my job right now, and kind of my view of explaining to Americans how their schools work, is the question we're here to talk about today is the generations of students who went to school during the pandemic and who for whom that was a life-changing experience, and how they're doing and what happens to them now. And that's what we're here to talk about. Solving for P, engaging, educating, and employing Generation Pandemic students. I like that term, and I'm going to start using it. I'm going to borrow it from you all. A couple of housekeeping things first. We're at the end of our presentation, right at the Q&A, we're going to put up a slide on the screens here that will have a QR code, which we'll hope you'll please complete for a quick survey about the ECMC group, which is putting together this panel. We'll talk about that in a bit. I invite you to attend a reception hosted by ECMC Group immediately following this discussion that will take place in the lobby outside the room. So there's a powerful incentive for all of us to wrap it up and get busy. I should just note ECMC Group is the sponsor of the Work Reimagined track, a new offering at South by Southwest EDU that focuses on new approaches to professional development, upskilling, corporate learning, and talent development. One focus of this track is how the future of work will impact new generations of students, which is kind of what we're here to talk about. I have a few just introductory points here. 4 years ago, as you all know, the pandemic upended all parts of our society, and how we worked and how students learned forever were altered, as most of the people in this room probably know. Dramatic changes in our education delivery that continues to reverberate in society, and coincidentally, just before the shutdown, ECMC launched an effort to gather insights from high schoolers about their wants and needs for their future education and work. So that's fascinating. The organization since then has conducted 7 national surveys and found dramatic shifts in this generation's plans for life after high school. I think we all are seeing that play out in our homes and our communities. So we're going to talk about that today. On the stage with me are 3 people who bring a unique perspective to this discussion. Maureen Ponce is a resource counselor at Northwood High School in Silver Spring, Maryland, not too far from where I live, and also the president of the Maryland School Counselor Association. Tamara Fields is the managing director of the Austin office of Accenture, where she seeks to attract and retain the next generation of workers. And Dan Fisher is the president and CEO of ECMC Group, an education nonprofit that has spent 30 years focused on helping students achieve their academic and professional goals. I'm just going to share, before we get started with the questions, a few statistics that ECMC has uncovered. Nearly half of high schoolers say post-secondary education should last 3 years or less. 1/3 say it should last 2 years or less. 78% think about their future weekly. 48% think about it daily. Think about that. Students age 14 or 18 think about their future on a daily basis. Only 13% of high school students feel prepared or make a decision about what to do after high school. I was not one of those 13%, I can tell you. That number drops to 8% for underserved students. Maureen, let's start with you. You've had more than 20 years working with students. What stands out to you as the biggest challenge that Generation P, these students who are in school during the pandemic, what are the biggest challenges they're facing as they seek to, figure out what they're going to do with their lives?
Yeah. This question had me thinking a lot because it's a really important time for young people as they graduate high school. And when I thought about what could be the one phrase that would describe the biggest challenge, for me is kids are having difficulty making a decision and what the right decision is for them. So many kids nowadays are trying to decide what that right decision is, but we're still kind of bringing kids to the one option. And we say college and career, but it really only means college, and it really only means four-year college. And so imagine young people, they hear that, but they can read between the lines, and kids are sometimes not ready. The pandemic has allowed us to see some of the inequities. They really highlighted some of those inequities when we talk about financially paying for college. It's not accessible to many students. And so it has really caused students to be either in a frenzy and they're just picking whatever, or they're in that freeze mode, they don't know what to do, so they don't pick, or they think they have it all figured out and they come to you with all these prepared answers. And it takes someone to help them unpack, regardless of where the student is, unpack what it is that they plan to do and make sure they understand all of the options and how to access all of those options.
Can I ask, how has it changed how you're talking to students and what you have to say to them and how you're trying to guide them?
Right. Great question. So I've been a middle school counselor for about 15 years, and I've been in high school for 10. That's an important context. So when I started high school, the question always was, when the students reach senior year, where are you going to college? So I was guilty of doing that as well. And as I've spoken to kids and understood more of their struggles, my approach has totally changed. And I have kids dream. I say, okay, if money's not an option, time is not an option, what would you like to do? And we start to explore it that way, and then we back map and say, okay, based on this dream, where do you need to go next? So that's the critical piece, because we're asking young people at 17 or 18, when their entire life has been planned for them, and all of a sudden they have to decide what to do. And we don't realize that's a big ask that we're asking young people to do. It's a very anxious, producing time, and we're not reflecting that we're asking kids to do something that they have never done before, which is, what do you want to do next? Not, do you have the rest of your life figured out, but what do you want to do next, and how can I help facilitate that for you as far as reaching your goals?
Tamara, your role is tied directly to building a diverse workforce. How have the events of the last few years changed how you work with this new demographic that's in the same way, wanting and needing different things from employers, and how are you kind of bridging that gap?
Yeah, absolutely. So, the first thing I would say as an employer today, especially if you're looking for diversification of employees, you've got to have multiple channels and sources to fulfill your employee needs. And I think in the past, especially as a Fortune 500 company, the traditional path was always the path that you looked at. You either did entry level straight out of a 4-year institution, or you did experienced hires, right? These are your two funnels for hiring across the board. But we saw even before the pandemic, right, we actually started diverse sources of hiring. We started an apprenticeship program. We started skills-based hiring. And skills-based hiring is looking at those advocates or those other pathways that don't always include 4-year institutions. So we did actually hire straight out of high school. We've hired through certificate programs. We've hired through 2-year and technical schools, right? And so what we have found, especially in my world, because we work a lot with technology is fast changing. And because it's fast changing, we can train on the job. Now, of course, when they haven't had the opportunity to mature through a 4-year program, right, you've got to find other ways to supplement for some of those soft skills. But we have found their ability to pick up on the hard skills was fast, and sometimes even faster for others, because they're ready to dive in, they're ready to learn, they've grown up with technology, they're used to using every type of application. So we never really had an issue with closing the skill gap in hard skills. Sometimes we had to close the skill gap in soft skills. We had to create cohorts. We had to create other ways to help them understand how to manage in a corporate environment and the expectations related to that, and what career planning and career path is. But overall, I'm a big believer in skill-based hiring, because I think it's a different way to think about the future. And I think ultimately, when we think about high schools, we really need to get back to not just a 4-year program, but we need to look at certificate programs, 2-year programs, trade schools, right? I think people forget that there's a lot of jobs out there, whether it's manufacturing to automotive, all of them are technical in nature in some way. And I think it's about, how do you increase the landscape of what job opportunities are beyond those traditional roles that people are originally introduced to in elementary school, like doctor, lawyer, policeman, right? And I just think the diversity of jobs is so much. And so what we've got to do is get that word out. We've got to expand the apprenticeship programs. I'm a big fan of those. And we've got to be willing to have diverse sources. I'm a big fan also of nonprofits as a source, right? So in Austin, you have Breakthrough Central Texas, right? You have the KIP program. You have all these different Code to College, right? All these different programs out there that I also think can be a great partnership to bring in diverse talent.
And just to clarify, what you're talking about is basically taking job descriptions and sometimes removing the requirement that it come with a 4-year degree.
Absolutely.
And saying we're gonna bring people up to speed in other ways.
Yeah, we actually went through formally, especially when we were expanding for diverse hiring, we found that most job descriptions were prohibitive. They don't mean to be, right? A lot of times they're a copy and paste, right? But we really took a hard look at what were the skills we were really asking for. We took away some of the year's expectations. We took away all of it because when we really thought about it, at the end of the day, I could train people what I needed them to learn, and I didn't really need them to start off 5 years with, some type of, Generation 6, coding capability, right? It was really about hiring for behavioral capabilities. It's hiring on potential. It's also, I think you'd be surprised. A lot of these kids do a lot of work outside of school today. They're pretty enterprising, and so they have a lot of skills already, and it's about teasing those out and having an interview process that allows you to do that. But you got to start with the job description because people self-select out, and what you really want to do is have people self-select in and really change the overall concept of how they're thinking about themselves and how we're thinking about that slate of diverse talent.
Fascinating, yes. Dan, would you mind just talking a little bit about ECMC Group and how you work with students and about what you found in this research over the recent years, kind of looking at this cohort of students that we're talking about?
Yeah, Steve, thanks for this, and thanks to South by Southwest for the discussion. I think this is really important not only from an employer standpoint and a counselor standpoint, but also for everybody who is concerned about the entire ecosystem. One of the things that we started looking at was really this voice of the student. We tried to focus not only on youth-centric design when we started looking within our own communities for solutions for some of these significant education gaps, but we also took a step back and we really wanted to spend time learning what these students would tell us about what's on their mind. So as most of these students, we found about 2/3 of these students believe that post-secondary education is necessary. Only about half think of that as a traditional 4-year pathway. So we're starting to see the aperture open up, as Tamara mentioned, about short-term programs, certificates, those types of opportunities that don't necessarily require a 4-year degree. And as we've been out in the field for probably 4 years now, we did our first survey just prior to the pandemic, so we do have pre-pandemic, pandemic, and now post-pandemic longitudinal data. We've seen the number of students that are really focused on just a 4-year pathway decline significantly in that time. So I think Tamara's message and the message that Maureen is sending out to their students that there are other pathways in addition to 4-year degrees has really begun to resonate with students. And some of that is because the cost of education continues to grow significantly. And so students are paying a lot more attention to not only the wage premium, but also the wealth premium. So they're being a lot smarter than I was back when I was going through that process, just signing up for student loans and taking out more aid and all of that stuff. They're really looking at the return on investment. So I'm very heartened to see the level of engagement in the broader term picture from the students that we're talking to.
Excellent. Maureen, I was fascinated by you kind of saying, trying to put it the student center and saying, where would you like to go and how can we get you there? It's like Dan, very different than my experience as a high school student a long, long time ago. Are you seeing some of these same trends in the students that ECMC has found when you look across their data? Are you seeing some of these things? And beyond your own individual, how you're dealing with an individual student, what do schools need to do to better prepare these students?
Right, great question. So I think we've got to get out of this box of what is right and add a little bit to that phrase. What is right for this student and this individual? Because that changes the conversation, right? And I still think that too many folks are pigeonholing many of our students and the options that are provided. And so it's really providing the ability for those conversations to happen and for students to have an opportunity to learn. So one of the greatest things that for me has been impactful is the importance of learning experiences that students need to have if I really want them to consider options. There's a lot of research on students that are exposed to multiple learning experiences. It increases their self-efficacy and also what they expect, the outcomes of beliefs about themselves. And so how can we as schools continue to kind of think about what are the experiences we're offering students, right? You can't wait until 12th grade, because what we're getting is kids are either in a frenzy trying to select something, they are frozen, or they're just willy-nilly picking things. And so that then requires, because now you're in a timeline as a 12th grader, right? You don't have a whole lot of time to make a decision. So how can we back map some of this and have those conversations and provide those experiences to students?
Tamara, a little bit of the same question. Could you talk a little bit more about what you were describing as the need to educate for optionality versus having all paths lead straight to a four-year degree, and some of the things that students do need, though, to be able to do and accomplish in that changing environment?
So I'll talk through a couple of things. I think something that you said, Maureen, that I think is really important is we need to give students experiences. I think that's exceptionally important. This summer, I'll be hosting over 120 high school interns through my office, and we'll be doing hundreds all across the country. And you might ask yourself, a high school student, why would you do that, right? What we have found is that people need experiences because it's hard for them to mentally understand what you say you do. I work in consulting. I can promise you my mother, I've been working in it for 2 decades and my mom still can't explain what I do, right? Like, I think fundamentally, right, some of the jobs that we have there, the nature of our world is complex. And so there really are a lot of opportunities and people have to figure out how to connect that. And the only way they can do that is by seeing it. And so we have made a commitment around bringing high school kids into the workplace because we think that if they can shadow and they can see and they can understand the environment, they'll get a perspective on, do I want this or do I not, right? I thought I really wanted to go down this path. And we do that whether they're interested in technology or not. And it's been really interesting to hear their feedback. So experiences, trying to get kids into programs and nonprofits that allow them to have internships or even short-term experiences and certificate programs or other things during the summer, I'm a huge fan of because I just think we need to broaden their knowledge of what is the possibility. In addition to that, right, I'm a big fan of even shorter programs. Like not every company will do a full, summer internship, paid or non-paid, right? But they do have like, little short 4-week programs and touring of their businesses. And we need to get back to taking kids to work day, right? I think it's about experiences and opportunity and activities. I'm a big fan of all the nonprofits. Like, obviously, I'm going to talk about things in technology because that's what I do. But Girls Who Code, right? We have a Coder Joe program. We start this in elementary school because, again, it's about how do we just get kids exposed to different experiences so they can just understand what is out there, right? And so I'm a big believer that we've got to expose them more. We got to widen the opportunity, and that's more than a one-day career fair because in a one-day career fair, they just don't get the concept, right? We've got to put more different diverse roles, jobs, and capabilities into the schools on a regular basis in a regular cycle and all types of roles and jobs. I think people would be shocked at, I was talking to the CEO of Capital Metro, right? And they have a lot of jobs that are all 6 figures. Do people know that? Right? I think that there's a lot of misunderstanding and I think it's about how do you think differently about your future and also really teaching them that what you decide today doesn't have to be what you do tomorrow. Because what we've noticed about the Gen Z and Alpha generation is that they stay in a role somewhere between 4 to 6 years and they jump. So it's very easy for them to realign their career and their future. They have no fear. Like I had a fear. Like me, right? I'm a Gen Xer, right? And I'm like, okay, I will change a job like a couple of times, but I'm all about stability and understanding how I'm going to get to a path. They have no issue with jumping roles, right? Switching jobs, switching concepts. And so I think that creates a lot of opportunities. So I just think the way you talk about it and the way you expose them overall, both in high school, I think it's got to be a shift. And I believe in cooperative agreements. Like, we need a stronger relationship between higher institutions, certificate programs, corporations, nonprofits, and how they come in and access students on a regular cycle, not once a year, not one day a year, right? How do we make a cycle of interaction and programs during the summer? I think those are going to be critical to shift the way we work.
And related to this, I have a question for all three of you. It involves, it seems like a player that we haven't really mentioned yet in this discussion between students and high schools and employers are community colleges. And it seems like they have a role in many communities that we've been looking at of reaching down with dual enrollment programs into the high schools, but also at having a really close relationship with local employers, the most prominent, and sort of gearing the curriculum of the college to what the needs are of local employers. And I wonder if just any of you have thoughts on the role that they can or should be playing.
Yeah, Steve, we've talked a lot about the connectivity between employers and community colleges and students, and we think that they absolutely have a role. I mean, to your point, community colleges need to make sure that they are preparing their students for their employers. They are a key segment in that pipeline between education and employment. And one of the things we're hearing from our students is they're very interested in that through line, right? They want to get from Maureen's world into Tamara's world, and there are checkpoints on that pipeline. And if a college is not being responsive through its educational offerings to the needs of the employers, that needs to change. And so employers absolutely need to have that connectivity with community colleges so that they can fulfill their mission to be responsive to the students and also focus on what the employers need.
I'll add too that I think that where I've really seen it work is in the health industry, to be frank. There's a strong linkage between the health industry and community colleges just because they were lacking talent. They didn't have a choice. And so you're seeing a lot of programs there, and you're seeing a lot of programs with the city and the county and creating programs with the community college, then to the health, so that there's a professional link there. And I know that's been really big here in Austin as we've expanded our health and medical field. And so I just think, again, those agreements are important, right? And they can have very focused sets of people, which I think is really important too. So when you're really looking for marginalized communities, like, it's a way for them to shift their world back into a world and a path of wealth creation. And so I've been seeing, and we've been focused on those programs through the city in partnership with the community college into then the employer, and it becomes a relationship between the two, because if one can identify, help fund childcare, one can get into the school, then this is promising the commitment of a role afterwards. That's the type of expansion we want to see.
Maureen, we have a large and prominent community college in Montgomery County, and I just wonder, is that a big part of your work, and are you talking to students about that?
Yes, so I'm going to be the downer here.
Okay.
So I liken it to a race, right? If you're running and you've got to pass the baton to the next person, and sometimes the baton gets dropped. And so one of the things that I find I'm having to support a lot of my students with, especially first-gen college students, our immigrant students, Black and brown students, is in that transition.
Really?
Yes. Interesting, this fall we had several kids come back to get help from us to complete financial aid forms, and they'd already graduated high school. And so the question we asked was, what's going on? Who's picking up these kids when they go to higher ed, right? They're used to having that one stable person throughout their high school experience. Once they get to community college, that may not be the case, right? When you call the number, make your appointment with a college advisor, it may be a different person every time. So that is one of the areas where I'm thinking about, and how do I wrap my head around supporting kids so that that baton doesn't get dropped? And how do we build some partnerships with some of those community colleges? And so we're having that transition happen earlier, before the kids graduate.
Fascinating. Thank you. A data point from the research by ECMC, 86% of high schoolers believe companies have a role in supporting education and careers by providing tuition reimbursement, formal education or subsidizing their education. Tamara, do these findings hold true to what you're seeing in your applicant pool, and is that what students are expecting and demanding?
So I think they definitely expect it.
Yeah.
Yes. And I think that what you're finding is it is still something provided in specific industries, but a lot of corporations are moving away from it because it's a high cost for them. And like in my world, we do tuition reimbursement, but it's a limited requirement, because the reality is technology is moving at the speed of light. I don't have a benefit for it, right? Because the minute they come out, what they just learned is already old, right? That's how fast it's moving. I think people are struggling because you're seeing that integration in every industry. Every industry today is a digital industry. Almost all of them use an advanced set of applications or software or capabilities. And the biggest struggles that corporations have is training. It's how do you get a resource up to speed, and then how do you retain them, right? And so as a result, there's less focus unless it's a requirement for regulation or law. So where you see licenses, you see it, of course, where you have, medical certificates, of course, you see it there. But in my industry, it just isn't there. And what we have found, we tell them, like, we don't offer more money just because you go get that program. So do the students want it? They do. Are we offering it? It's becoming less and less in the industries.
One of the things we've seen, Steve, is maybe a little different perspective in some of the career and technical education spaces. And part of this is just a response to the macro labor environment, where those organizations that might have HVAC technicians or electricians or some of the skilled trades are maybe leaning in a little bit more, because the labor shortage is more acute and they rely on that labor. And so when you think about the role for those employers, particularly in the trades and the career and technical education space, I think that they are looking at that a little different, because if they can't get qualified HVAC technicians or qualified electricians, they have no business. And that's not only important to that business, it's important to the economy. And so that's maybe a little different perspective from that segment.
Thank you. And then, Maureen, back to you for a second, because I can only imagine, we've done extensive reporting on this, the challenges that this generation of students are facing with mental health. Yes, it was a problem before the pandemic, but the last few years seem to have made this work, and I just wonder, how is this affecting the students you're working with, and how do all of these players in the system need to adapt to that?
Right. So yes, mental health was already a concern. It just became more apparent as a result of the pandemic. And so how, we know kids are coming to us, I almost feel like they're on a tightrope, right? And what's that one thing that may break? And just that awareness, and how do we begin to remove some of those barriers that perhaps are contributing to some of the mental health struggles? We talk about mental health, but where do we make space for the discussion, for the healing to occur? And so how are we intentional in doing that work? Because people don't heal by themselves. They need community to heal. And so in the work that we're doing, whether it's as they're preparing for post-secondary, how are we preparing students with some of those skills they're going to need once they're adults and on their own?
I just want to shift gears a little bit. Is about, well, here's an easy way of asking this question. Who needs to change more here? This group of students, or the people who are serving them, or it's kind of an awkward or kind of a phony sort of contradiction. But what needs to change most in the discussions that these young people are having with the grown-ups who are trying to help them out?
Well, I'll just start by saying I think the educational ecosystem needs to understand what students are really asking for.
Yeah.
And as Maureen said, mental health issues have always been there, but students are becoming more vocal about it because it's more open and maybe a little less stigmatized than prior to the pandemic. I have 2 kids in college, and they talk about it a whole lot more than I thought was talked about prior to the pandemic. And they talk about it a lot more on their campuses. And so one of the things that we've seen is the whole basic needs environment, right? This is what is top of mind for a lot of these students, particularly the underserved. It's how do I get mental health benefits? How do I have food security? How do I make sure, particularly in a non-traditional college, right? I went to a residential college, I lived in the dorms, I ate in the cafeteria. We didn't have those concerns. So many more students now are in community colleges or they are in commuting environments. So they have to worry about all of those those basic needs here. And schools need to better understand what the students are really concerned about. Because if they can address them, if they can have, more security for those students, I think it'll benefit not only the schools, but also the students.
I think it depends on which audience organization you're asking. I think if it's the parents, the family, and the adult friends in their lives, if I think about my godchild, I think, she's a senior this year, so, we went through all of the discussions last year when they started to this fall, and she had a lot of stress about trying to figure out what was she going to do, what does she want to do, why does she want to do it, where does she want to go, and, it just came down to, I had to tell her, it's okay. It's okay, right? Because there's just so much stress there, and I think it's about helping her understand that she has options. And I think it's about helping her understand her strengths. One of the things I think we lack in high school education that we always do when you come out of high school and out of college, and even in college they do it, is you spend a lot of time developing behavioral skills and conversations around leadership, around what is your leadership style, what are your strengths, right? I think a lot of these kids don't really understand their strengths, and so they don't understand how they can map into an environment or a capability or a certificate program. They're just trying to live, and depending on their socioeconomic background, right, there's a lot of mental barriers there. There's a lot of emotional barriers there that have to be addressed, and a lot of times people don't like to talk about those honestly, but it's not easy, right? And so, if I think about my godchild who's raised by a single mother, she had a lot of worries. She has a lot of worries about leaving her mother, and she's not there, right? And so we had to talk about these things. So I think conversation is really important, open and honest conversation. I think leadership skills and really making sure that high schools are really spending the time ahead of time to spend the time. And again, that's a lack of resourcing, right? There should be focused programs and programming and funding behind that, which isn't today. I think in terms of, all of us, right, we've got to recognize that this is an ever-changing landscape and environment, and we're going to all have to shift and be fast with it, right? And then I think in terms of corporations, right, as they rethink hiring and skills-based hiring, it's really important to create cohorts and connections right out the door. Because if you don't, there is already these anxiety, insecurities, mental health barriers, right? So there is a social consciousness that is now required in companies, corporations, institutes, small businesses that weren't there before, and everybody has to adapt. So I think in the past, right, even small businesses would be like, well, I don't have the money for that. Well, guess what? You won't keep your employee, and it costs you a lot more money to have to keep replacing that person. So I think everybody has to shift to the fact that the expectation of these students and employees in general have shifted, and we've got to be organic in that shift with them and think about how we're going to accomplish those things and still deliver on what we're accountable to.
Thank you. I have one just quick follow-up on that, is I just think of employers, and what we're talking about is maybe a willingness to hire students who are not coming out of, who are not finishing up a 4-year degree. But what we know about the brain development of young people, what does it mean for an employer to face the fact that they may be hiring students who are younger, who are less, whose brain isn't, cemented in a certain way? I guess maturity is a word I would use. What does that mean for employers to kind of work with students who are coming with that different experience?
You have to have a program. So
Yeah.
We formalized for our skill-based hiring a formalized apprenticeship program, and it's a year long. We initially, when we launched, we had some difficulty. It was a shorter program. It was as you hired, that didn't work, and I'll just be honest about that. What we found is that we had to hire in groups. So that means even if they were doing completely different jobs, they needed to have a group of people with them because they felt very insecure coming into this environment of people that were new hires, because generally they were starting together, and it just created some weird dynamics. So what we decided was that it needed to be a specialized program. They needed to have their own cohort. We needed to specialize leadership training, mentorship training, sponsorship training, all of these things, right? We had to create social gatherings, right? We had to create a network for them. We had to approach it completely different. I mean, we even did classes on etiquette at dinner.
Right.
Like, I think because, again, people just had different backgrounds. So rather than assume, we just put a program together, and then we started a shadowing process that we found to be much more effective than just teaching them the skill. We wanted them to shadow so that they could gain experience over time. And then at the end of that apprenticeship program, it was, do you want to stay or do you want to go? So it wasn't an automatic, right? But the majority stayed, and the majority went into a full-time role, which is great. But that's how we did it, is because we realized that initial hire direct in our world was not as effective without having all of that surrounding capability.
And Maureen, the question for you, how does high school need to change to kind of adapt to this different environment that we're talking about, where you're maybe not just preparing them to go off to college?
Well, what I was loving and what I'm hearing is intentionality and being proactive. We have the data. We know where kids are struggling. And so how are we being intentional and proactive in creating the support systems that they need while they're in high school, as they're transitioning to post-secondary, and then making that connection for the students. So that's the part that really tugs at my heart is I got to know my data, and I got to know where my kids need the support, and then where am I going to use my skills as the adult, right? Because it's not the kids, right? We don't want to say it's a kid issue. It's an adult issue.
Right.
We have to figure out the system because they're coming into the system we've established. And so that's the charge that we have as educators.
And I really think that I wanted to just draw a thread from Tamara's comment about being intentional with some of these programs, because I think they are great equalizers, not only from a maturity standpoint and a brain development standpoint, but also from an equity standpoint, because it really levels the playing field for somebody who may not be in the same environment, that they've learned the same soft skills, or they may not have the same etiquette experiences that other people have had, particularly for the generation that we're talking about here, because they've spent so much time focusing on their screens, right?
Yeah.
We pushed them into their bedrooms where they spent sometimes a year and a half on Zoom. And now that they're kind of coming out into the light, they have this digital fluency that back in the day was a positive differentiator, but now it's table stakes. But interpersonal fluency is now the positive differentiator. And so when you go into an organization like Accenture, she has that expectation that everybody knows the technology, but that interpersonal fluency that we can help support this generation is really going to be important to both level the playing field and also help support some of the less mature people coming from that pipeline.
This is something that fascinates me about four-year schools, is I don't think, in general, they're doing a great job teaching people how to prepare for a job interview, or how to respond to critical feedback in the workplace, or I don't know, maybe how to dress appropriately in the job market. Like, where can and should young people be learning these things?
Some are in four-year schools.
Yeah,
so
and I know it's changed. I know it's changed a lot.
Yeah, so again, thinking back to my experience, I've got two kids that are at the same college actually, and they have a career service office that is, a little bit like the program Tamara was talking about. They talk about interview skills, they go through mock interviews, but it really is a privileged environment to have the resources to be able to do that. Community colleges may not have that resource. Career and technical education schools that are really focused on hard skills and the skills trade, they may not have that same level of resource. So again, when you get out into the employment world, a program like Accenture has is really a leveler.
Yeah. Other thoughts on that? Maureen?
So I was just thinking, like, how do we all own this work? Because
Yeah.
it's really important. It's like there's not enough people to send the kids to, right? So how do we all become owners in this work to support kids? And how are we teaching these important skills that they need, these life skills, these social skills in our everyday interactions? And so as adults, we have to ask ourselves, are we also being intentional in the opportunities that we have when we engage with students to provide that guidance and that support? Because there's not enough people to send them to. There's just not enough.
It just seems to be hanging over so much. I mean, again, your work in particular and the number of students per counselor, you know, there's just not enough time to do all these things, and I guess you're offering a good point. And then, which leads me to another question, especially given that we're here at South by Southwest. What is the role technology can or should be playing in all of this? Dan, I was thinking about what you're saying. So many of these students are, I see it as a college educator. Their level of engagement with technology is at such a higher level. But what technological solutions are there in some of the challenges and the problems we're talking about here, whether any of you are seeing that?
Yeah, so I would say that from a technology perspective, we're on the beginning of where it's going to go, especially when you think about Gen AI.
Right.
And especially because Gen AI now has the large language models. So because it has, you know, normal vernacular speak that it didn't have in the past, its ability to train and interact is going to be exponential over the next couple of years. So what we're going to see over the next 2 decades, right, is as a massive increase in technology learning. So right now, what y'all are used to is typical computer-based, web-based type training, right? Some of you might be used to simulator type training, right? You definitely see that in the automotive world, right? You see that for sure in plants and manufacturing plants. But you're taking it to the next level, right? And so they were trying it, and you're seeing it on some level with the metaverse world. But I think what it's really going to be is like, how do you train people and really create it in a natural, organic way with interactive models and capabilities? That's going to be the next wave that you're going to see. So it's like, how do you normalize certificate programs out of institutions, actually, out of classrooms, to where people can really not just take an online class, but they could go from beginning to end with an entity and be really proficient at the end based on how they interact. So I think eventually that's what you're going to see over the next couple of decades, is the expansion of that. And I think what we've got to think about then is, what's the role of the human with that technology? Because that's what's really shifting in the career landscape right now, is that some of the tactical, mundane, repeatable work, right, like old school assembly lines, got replaced by machines, and then the humans had to force, you know, what is the supply chain? How do I resolve this error when the supply chain, you know, machine isn't working? Well, now what you're going to move to, you're going to see a lot more software development by AI tools, but somebody still has to do the critical thinking to figure out what that development code needs to be. So there's an overall shift in critical thinking. So I think in general, right, we've got to think about, and I think our education system is too far behind. It's not moving fast enough, right, with the dynamic that's changing in the world around technology, and that's why these kids are teaching themselves. They know how to build full platforms. I'm telling you, they know how to build websites and sell shoes. They can do everything. They understand how to make money off of TikTok. Do you know how to make money off of TikTok? Like, I'm telling you, like, their concept is exponential, and so you're going to see the same in the learning, and it's just about making it affordable and accessible, and that's the real issue. The real issue is accessibility for all socioeconomic and ethnic backgrounds, and how do we evolve education with that access?
Let me ask any or all of you to look in the crystal ball a little bit. One of the things that's sometimes held up as a good quality of the American educational system is people have access to it at various phases in their life. And as you were saying, Tamara, you know, these are people this is a generation that's going to be very comfortable changing careers or changing their job. How do we look ahead and meet the needs, whether it's education or employment or wherever, to follow these people through their lives as they decide that they want to do something different? Maybe they do want to go back to college or do something totally different. What do you see in the future for this very interesting generation?
Yeah, I'll maybe take a first stab at that. And I think what we see are, first and foremost, students who are understanding that their pathway does not end at 22 from an educational perspective.
Right.
So they come out of whatever post-secondary education they're taking, whether it's a stackable credential or a 2-year degree or something, and they recognize that there is more to come, right? And it may not be in their 20s, it may be in their 30s, it may be, you know, as Tamara said, as these students become employees and have shorter tenures and more jobs, there may be more education between those jobs than our generation is used to.
I 100% agree. I think continuous learning is your reality, and I think the word that everyone needs to memorize is reskilling. Reskilling is the reality of our new to-be world. And so it's about how do we formulate, push, identify, create the opportunity around reskilling. It means you've got to have reskilling certificate programs in community colleges and higher education programs. You got to have apprenticeship programs and employees, right? Employers, right? And so I think it's how do you reskill, because I think you're going to see that dynamic movement happening over the next several decades.
From the education perspective, I think there needs to be some investment in how do we bring our educators up to speed. Yeah. So like in my district, I'll give an example. They're hiring a lot of career coaches to work in the schools, and they come in the schools, but then when I ask other staff, they don't understand why. So how do you get staff buy-in for even the resources that are there, not understanding the ever-changing landscape of careers and why we need kids as early as middle school to be thinking about careers. So a lot of times we're not investing. And so we talk about student voice, but we forget that there's staff voice as well. And they need to understand the why so they can get on board. Otherwise, we're not working in the same direction.
I love that, Maureen. I think that is such an astute observation, because I think that we've got to educate and we got to help them understand. Because I just think you're so easy to be caught up in your world. My family are all educators, right? My grandmother was a teacher. My great-grandmother was a teacher. My aunt's a teacher. My cousin's a teacher. My other aunt's a teacher, right? And I spent a lot of time talking to them about this, because I can tell you my Aunt Wanda, like, she's like, what are you talking about, Tamara, right? Like, in her mind, she thinks very traditional ways in terms of kids and what they should be doing and how they think about their life. I mean, I think that is such a spot-on activity. How do we create the interest? How do we bring people into conferences like South by EDU, right? Because I just think, again, it's like we've got to shift the thinking of the adults, and you said that earlier, Maureen. I think that's really very wise.
This was great. I want to open it up to questions from there. As we said earlier, if you have a question, please come up to the mic. But I want to ask just one final question while that happens, was where, and maybe this is a question for you, Dan, who's doing this right? Where are you seeing the most exciting, promising innovations where you would point to and say, that's what our research shows is really working?
Well, I think it's small scale, right? I think there are very innovative community colleges across the country. The scale is hard. I'll maybe give one example in terms of bridging the equity gap and focusing on some underserved students. I think Georgia State University is doing it really well. They are a very large school in Atlanta, Georgia. They're a public 4-year college, and their student demographics have shifted over the last 10 or 15 years. They are now majority minority students. They have increased the Pell Grant students year over year, so the socioeconomic challenges of their students has only increased. And yet the work that they've done to support their students, particularly their underserved students, they've gotten to the point where their equity gaps are almost entirely closed. So if you come into Georgia State as a first-generation, low-income, minority student, you are no more less likely to graduate than my oldest son. And I think they've realized that it takes a lot of different interventions, right? They're using some technology. They're also using a lot of data. So they're trying to measure where their innovations are actually moving the needle and where they're not. So the first thing they did is they just gathered dozens and dozens of data points from their students, and then from that, it took a long time, it took a lot of work, but they're doing a really nice job with it. And I think that they've created an institute for student success there at Georgia State, and they're starting to work with other schools and other systems to try to replicate that. But it's a lot of work, it's a lot of discipline, and they're just getting started.
Cool. Fascinating. Thank you. There's a question back here, I think.
Hi. Hello. My name is Rachel, and I work at University of Colorado Boulder as an undergraduate academic advisor in engineering. So I'm kind of on the, after they're from high school, they come to us, work with students from first year all the way until graduation, and I run a peer mentoring program. And I'm curious, with the students you've spoken with and worked with, what would you recommend from an interpersonal standpoint that we focus more on with this population of students?
Who's ready to take that one?
I'll take the first pass. I'm really, really active. So my alma mater is University of Texas at Austin. I'm a Longhorn. And so when I think about four-year institutions, right, I'm a big fan of student organizations and having a strong link between the career services organization within your school and the student organizations, and really fostering and facilitating a set of behaviors and expectations around interpersonal development. So going back to resume development, case interviewing testing, right? How do you do etiquette classes? How do you do all of that? And so even just a couple of weeks ago, I was on campus and I did an etiquette session for HBSA, which is the Hispanic Business Student Association, right? Going in and really facilitating these type of I've gone in and done leadership classes. We've done leadership 101. We've done classes around how do you think about your communication skills? How do you think about your attire? And I think, and it's really important in engineering, by the way, because engineering, they are horrible at behavioral interviews, just by the way. Like their minds don't understand. They can do a case study all day, but like if you ask them a simple question, like, tell me a time when you critically had to X, they look at you like with blank stares. But I think, again, having as many programs as you can where you have that connection so you get access to a broad set and you formulate that throughout. I will also tell you a lot of corporations do sponsor career services programs with students, and I think creating that cooperative agreement is really important because they already have the program. You don't need to develop it. They already have them in their corporate. They could just bring it in and teach it, and they like being active in that way. So I think I'm a big fan of just having conversations around what do you need to think about? How do you have a one-on-one coffee chat with someone? Let me tell you, the hardest thing for these kids is just to sit down and be in person with someone and have a 30-minute coffee chat freaks them the crap out. So I would just say, like, having some conversations where you can practice them on that. How do you have a set of questions? It seems really basic, but basic is missing today. And I think those are things you got to focus and leverage.
Something I'd like to add, in my perfect world, I would love for when my students graduate that I can hand them over to someone, a person that I know I can connect them with. Because our students need social capital. They don't know anyone at the school, and they're coming from an institution that they maybe spent 3 or 4 years. They knew everyone. They knew who to go to for what. When they go to college, they're starting ground zero. And a lot of times the ownership is put on the student. If you have a question, come here. But where are we doing some of that intentional outreach for students? Last week, I had the privilege of having some of our former graduates come talk to I do a leadership empowerment group every year with our ESOL female students, Latinas. And so we had some of the girls that had done the program come back and talk about the college experience. And that was the overwhelming piece of information that they shared. It was very scary from them, coming from a place where they knew everyone and how to access, to a place where they knew no one and they didn't know how to access. And they had to somehow figure out how to go to people and figure it out. And so that's a really critical piece. Like, how are we creating the outreach rather than waiting for students to come to us with questions?
I'll just add that I think from my perspective, the ability to be in a safe space is important, right? So talking to people that are maybe not at Tamara's level, but maybe somebody that they hired a year ago that maybe they had an overlap with on campus. And maybe it's not an organization like Accenture that they're hoping to find a job at, but maybe it's just, kind of a throwaway opportunity, because what you want them to do is the basic stuff, as Tamara mentioned. You want them to figure out how to get from here to that office, have a cup of coffee, see what it looks like, talk to a grown-up that's maybe not all that grown up, maybe they still have most of their hair, but that's an opportunity for them in a less threatening environment, because it really is a progressive process.
I see we're getting down to the wire here. Are there other questions from the audience? Questions from folks? It's hard to see, so you'll have to speak up. Last thoughts by any of you? This was a great discussion. I'm fascinated by it. Oh, there we go. Fire away.
I'm sorry that this isn't as much of a question, but something that really helped me in my community college, they had a class literally called First Year Experience, and that helped me learn how to navigate the college environment and sort of get that orientation of, yeah, you graduated high school, but here it's a little different. So with the First Year Experience, I remember in the first week we got to do a tour of the whole school to see like where the academic advisors are, the counselors, the financial aid office. So really just having those in-person interactions or experiences to tour a college and get to know more about it was really helpful for me as a first-year college student.
What was the biggest thing you remember learning in that class?
The biggest thing I remember learning in that class was how to abuse office hours. If the professor likes me, they're more likely to bump that B+ to an A.
You know, I wish my students had learned that, because we actually did a story on NPR recently, a couple of years ago, about the fact that students never go to office hours. They just won't do it. As a first-generation college student, I was terrified of them. With my students now, I kind of force them to show up and make an appointment with me and talk to me so I can get to know them a little bit. That's a great factoid there.
Thank you.
Thoughts? Tamara, I'm curious how a course like that, or how employers need to do the same thing, a tour, you know.
Oh, I'm a huge fan. I mean, I'm a big fan of 101. I'm a big fan of also first-year college in their family programs as well, first-year college, if they have them. And so I think there are institutions that do. We started one for McCombs at UT in partnership with one of our clients, and so I'm a big fan altogether. And I think for employers, it's really about creating that kind of that orientation group, right?
Yeah.
Which is key. So definitely a fan of that.
We've seen a lot. We've done some reporting on places. My own alma mater, the University of Michigan, has an extensive program for first-generation students. But I think, and a separate program for rural students, people who come from small towns, for whom Ann Arbor is a big city. And I know lots of colleges do that. But it seems boy, could I have used
I just think it's important, right? My college roommate came from Jefferson, Texas, y'all. It's really small. Her dorm was bigger than her city.
Right.
It was so overwhelming for her. And so I do think these things, like you just said, Maureen, right? It's about making it small, making it accessible, making it not seem so daunting, I think, for our students is key to success. And you said the word student success. And I think that's really what it's all about.
That is a great place to end right there. I can't think of a better ending note. I guess we'll see you all outside at this reception, right? Thank you very much for coming.